Hello everyone, Dom here with a quick tip and tutorial video. First off, I wanted to apologize for the last oxygen video. It wasn't to my standard, and I wanted to take some time and revamp what I had previously created, since I don't think it was an efficient use of people's time. So I'm going to do a 2.0 version of my oxygen recommendations for early game. So to start that off, we're going to look at each building, the first being the algae terrarium. And for this one, it's not a very efficient setup, and that's because you have two different actions that need to be brought for the algae terrarium to work. That's 30 grams of algae and 300 gallons of water just to get this small amount of 40 grams of oxygen per second. The other parts of that is it does remove carbon dioxide and gives you polluted water. But when you have polluted water, the problem is each duplicant that breathes in the off-gassing polluted oxygen, they get yucky lungs. And what yucky lungs does is it increases the amount of grams of oxygen that duplicant needs to consume by 30 grams per cycle for the duration of the status. So in my opinion, these are not very good and efficient, especially for long term. There might be some setups out there that show you how to do them and make them efficient, but in most of my playthroughs I tend to avoid the algae terrarium because of those issues. Moving on to the oxygen diffuser. Now this is a good building because at the beginning of the game, because it allows you to push into cycles, say 15 to 20, without an electrolyzer setup, depending on how many duplicants that you acquire, right? So if you have too many duplicants, you will need an electrolyzer setup sooner, but let's go over the specific requirements. It's 550 grams of algae per second and 120 watts of power. So you have an extra power consumer. So if you just do the quick math, if you have 4 of those, then that's 480 watts of power just to run 4 of these. So over time, this gets to be pretty hefty on your power consumption in the early game the more you have. So it provides 500 grams of oxygen per second, and it also increases the heat in the vicinity by 1.5 kDTU. I'm not exactly sure. I don't remember what the actual metric is. Please excuse my knowledge there. And it has a negative decor bonus, which we all know the duplicants don't like to see. But anyways, this will carry you into the mid game until you can get some sort of electrolyzer setup going. Speaking of which, let's move on right to that. For the electrolyzer, it does also consume 120 watts of power, just like the oxygen diffuser. That's why it's more efficient, because it only takes water and does not have as much of a negative compared to the other one. But we have a liquid intake pipe. It does require you to add plumbing to it, right, and power, but that's just the requirements for that. Now, I love the electrolyzer because of all the different types of setups that you can use it in. There's a ton of different SPOMs. I'm going to feature one in the video here shortly, but in the meantime, if you don't have a SPOM setup and you need oxygen now, yeah, I know it sounds like one of those infomercials, right? What you'll want to do is put it at the top of your base if you do not want to make a SPOM setup, right? And to make it more efficient, you would want to create some sort of ceiling that has an area where the hydrogen can conform to. And in this sense, you would have a gas pump up here. You would put a little bit of automation, not a ton of it. You need an AND gate, and I believe you can just flip this around like so. The gas element sensor here and here, and then 2 automation wires like this, right? Then you change this element sensor to a hydrogen gas, copy the settings, and put it over here. And what this is going to do is it's going to make sure that you have hydrogen in this area capable of actually pumping hydrogen, and you won't pump oxygen out of it right until it's ready with the hydrogen. So that's a generic setup without the SPOM. I would use that in situations like dire situations where you are running out of oxygen and you don't have the time right now to build a SPOM before you run out of oxygen. That is why I would set up something like that. And you know, that's just kind of not the best and most efficient use of the electrolyzer. Moving on, this is the sublimation station, mostly utilized in asteroids that have polluted dirt. I don't recommend using this in the other ones that especially if you have algae and a lot of water to spare. These are mainly for asteroids that do not have either one of those and you have a surplus of the polluted dirt. So this is going to output a bunch of the polluted oxygen, 660 grams of polluted oxygen. But when you have these, you're going to want to have a filtration system, probably a bunch of deodorizers on top of an airflow tile. Not specifically this setup, but something along the lines of it, where you force the air to go through these, just so it allows it to get turned into clean air, especially in the beginning of your colony. But again, I do not recommend the sublimation station unless you are forced to. So moving on to the actual tutorial part of the video here. This is not my creation. This is a creation that I found a while ago, and I really like this setup because it's not very high maintenance and can be created, I'd say, in the amount of time it would take for you to do a lot of smaller tasks. So it's not task heavy, and that is why I use them. So this is the first overlay. This is number 1. We have a bunch of insulated tiles and then some airflow tiles and some of the manual airlock doors. Now I recommend putting this setup in a cold biome if you can manage it, and that's just because then you don't have to really worry about things getting too hot. You don't need to change the metal type of the actual buildings and that sort of thing. Moving on to setup 2 with the actual buildings in the locations. The Atmos sensors, I would change them to above 1,000 grams until you are ready to start pumping out either the air in here first or turn it on in general. So this is kind of the generic setup that I follow through with before I get into the wiring and the automation. So let's move on to number 3. If I'm looking at the automation, there's one automation wire going to each gas pump, and that's it for this first part of the setup. Again, you can choose to leave these above 1,000 grams until you're ready to do what you want it to do. I mean, you can even change this to higher than that. You probably will need to, but again, this is just however you want to handle the oxygen inside of the SPOM first. That's all up to you. Moving on to the power grid. This is just a simple setup, and the total amount of power for all of this is 600 watts total. So with one hydrogen generator, you could totally take care of this and have it in its own self-contained loop, because a hydrogen generator is 800 watts positive as opposed to the 600 negative in this loop. So this is what the power looks like. Moving on, we are going to talk about the pipe. If you have this set up in a cold biome, you will need to put a insulated liquid pipe going into the electrolyzer. This is to stop the pipe from bursting because of the cold and freezing up the water that's inside of it. Now, if you have polluted water coming into a sieve, then out of the sieve it'll have to be the insulated pipe. But generally, you just want to have it set up to where it's insulated water, just to protect it from that colder temperatures. Moving on to the gases. So I have a standard setup with a reservoir here, no automation or anything of that kind, with a power grid. The oxygen that's going to be pumped out of the gas pump down here is going into a radiant pipe, just to cool it down even more so, because when it comes out of this room, it's going to be a little hot. So we're going to cool it down with a cooling loop and radiant pipe choose a material that best suits your needs. Obviously, it's definitely something to look into. I just did, what is it here? I think this is just made out of sandstone. I didn't change it. No, I didn't change it. It's all sandstone. But this just gives you the idea of what you want to do. Some materials are better to use than the others, obviously. So that's going to drop directly into your base with the oxygen loop there. So moving on to the last part, this is a fully completed setup that would be functional if I had duplicates on this sandbox colony, but I do not at the moment, so we can't actually see it in action. I'm going to go over each overlay. So we have the first one is the insulated pipe coming from the pump, and this is, you know, a standard setup that you would use just for water. In my colonies, I like to have them pulling out of reservoirs. That's just how I like to do it. Now moving on to the wiring, so we have a transformer up here. We don't need the fancy transformer. This is just the regular power transformer right here going into the SPOM itself. So we have, oh, missed a wire. Can't miss a wire, right? So now we have all of that connected after the transformer, and this is just what it looks like. I have these manual generators here in case something goes wrong and we don't have enough power, we don't have enough hydrogen. This is just to get them going, and then once that is done, I change these to like a lower priority of like 1 or 2, depending on how fast I run out of power and the like. And then when these are ready, when you are either have a vacuum in here or there is a hydrogen in every single one of these 6 squares, that is when I would recommend changing this to above 740 grams, and then the one down here 420 above, and that's how what I would recommend when all of this is hydrogen above and oxygen below. So you can just have this bottom one running the entire time. That's just to get as much of the oxygen out as possible. If you want it to be faster, then you would have a ventilation setup right next to this, say like over here, and then you can cut the pipe off temporarily until all of the oxygen is out, and then once the oxygen is in a vacuum, or once this has a vacuum, then you can just cut this pipe again and then rebuild it like that. So that's how I set up my mini SPOMs. That gets me through quite a bit at the beginning and early stages of the game. If you're struggling to have just hydrogen in these 6 tiles here, there is a trick where you have a duplicate come in and out a couple of times until the oxygen dissipates into the lower section of the SPOM. That is the only way that I know of that's easier than having to create a vacuum, or if you're having issues and didn't do the vacuum method first. So again, that is part of that. And then we look at the gas valve here with the ventilation setup. So I have it going into the hydrogen generator and then into a gas valve. Generally, I just leave it at 50 grams to start and see how backed up this pipe gets, and then you can manually change that to whatever your needs are that allows this pipe to be completely backed up so you never run out of hydrogen. There are way more efficient setups to this. This is just how I like to do it in some of my cases. I've found that, you know, how many ways can you do the same thing in this game? There are a ton. So again, folks, that's it for this video. That's the quick tutorial that I wanted to show and give my take on it. Please feel free to comment on here and provide any sort of insight that you may have that will help any other new players out with their generation of oxygen, especially in the early stages. That's it. Have a wonderful rest of your day. We'll see you on the next video.